They'll tell you it's just a ranch, a spread of sunburned country where the wind has the right of way and a man can still hear his own thoughts. They'll tell you it's emptiness, and emptiness can't be guilty of anything. But stand out there on the edge of it, and you'll learn a different truth, because emptiness is not the same as innocence, and distance is not the same as safety. It's late summer in New Mexico, the kind of afternoon where the light comes down like a verdict. The heat has a way of thinning the world until it feels like you're living inside a held breath. A state truck rolls to a stop on the shoulder, dust curling behind it in a slow, reluctant plume, and a man steps out into the silence with papers in his hand. The papers are warm already, as if the sun has been reading over his shoulder. He's sweating at the temples, not from exertion, but from that dry, persistent pressure the high desert puts on a body. He walks to the gate like someone walking up to a door he doesn't expect to open. The gate is metal, simple, practical, the sort of thing you'd see anywhere cattle might drift. But the lock on it is not a ranch lock. The lock is the kind of lock that believes in itself. Behind it, a road runs inward and disappears into scrub and distance, into a property measured not in yards, but in acreage, 7,922 acres of private ground, and beyond that the land that isn't even private, the public trust acres stitched into the same silence, as if the state itself had unknowingly hemmed a cloak for a stranger 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe, give or take. It sits out there like a withheld answer, with an address that sounds too clean for the things people whisper about it. 340 Rancho San Rafael. The man with the papers, he's not a cowboy, not a deputy, not a journalist with a camera slung on his shoulder. He's an employee, a function, a citizen with a job title. His job is to inspect. That's all. To look at state trust land, 1,243 acres, a number that doesn't sound like much until you try to walk it, and make sure the leaseholders are doing what they promised when they signed. That's what the paperwork says. That's what the system says. The lease, the duty, the inspection, the public interest. Words that feel sturdy until you stand at a locked gate and realize words don't cut steel. He holds the pages against the wind with his thumb. The wind smells like juniper and dry grass, and the faint mineral sting of baked stone. Somewhere a bird calls once, harsh and impatient, and then the land goes back to listening. The man lifts a hand to shade his eyes, looking down that private road as if the distance might give up a clue. There's no movement, no cattle, no rider, no dog, just the shimmer of heat and the low brush crouched against the light. He takes out his phone. He calls. It rings into nothing. He tries again. The gate does not move. The lock does not negotiate. This is the moment nobody sings about, the moment the legends skip. Not the poker game, not the dramatic confrontation. Just an ordinary man with an ordinary duty, standing in extraordinary wealth's shadow, realizing the boundary between public authority and private power can be as thin as a chain on a gate, and just as hard, because this land wasn't assembled by romance. It was assembled the way empires are assembled in America, with signatures, with trusts, with entities that have names like weather systems. It was bought in 1993 for roughly $12 million, $12 million for a kingdom of scrub and sky. And then it was built up the way a fortress is built up, not to keep cattle in, but to keep questions out. By 1999, a mansion rose there, hacienda style, the word hacienda doing a lot of work to make it sound like heritage. instead of intention. Something like 26,700 square feet of rooms and corridors and doors, the kind of square footage that turns footsteps into echoes. And around it, the accessories of permanence, guest houses, stables, offices, outbuildings, a grass airstrip cut into the earth like a quiet promise that you could arrive and leave without anyone seeing the dust on your tires. They say the desert keeps what you bury. They say the wind scours the past clean. But the desert does not forgive. It only preserves in its own way, by bleaching and drying and making everything look the same from far enough away. And if you came out here after the headlines broke, after the name became poison, after the man at the center of it all was dead and the world started asking what happened behind that gate, you'd find the same thing that Inspector found: a lock, a refusal, a silence so expensive it had to be maintained. So what is this story, really? Is it a story about one notorious man and one notorious property? A freakish outlier on the edge of the map? Or is it a story about the oldest American alchemy? How land becomes money, and money becomes privacy. And privacy becomes a kind of sovereignty that even the state has to call ahead for? Was Zorro Ranch a retreat, a playground, a piece of real estate with a bad reputation that can be renamed and resold like a horse with a scar? Or was it a blueprint, an instruction manual written in acreage and corporate filings and locked gates, showing how easy it is to build a kingdom inside a democracy as long as you can afford the walls? All right, I'm Russ Daniels, and I've been digging through deeds and lease records and old reporting long enough to know this story only works if we take it slow. So if you want me to keep chasing ranch country tales like this and try to make it my full-time work, because I genuinely love this land and the people in it, subscribe with me. Make it a pact. It don't cost a thing. And I'm asking straight, why are you watching right now? Do you love ranches or something? Or are you trying to figure out what kind of world lets a gate like that stay shut? They say it began as nobody's land, a forgotten patch of high desert that sat out there doing nothing but growing sage and waiting for rain. That's the romance people like. America as empty canvas, a man stepping into it with nothing but grit and vision. But the truth is colder and older. This ground was never empty. It was simply quiet. And quiet land doesn't mean unclaimed land. It means land claimed so long ago the claimant has turned into paperwork and habit. Stand there and you can feel how the place tricks the eye. The horizon looks wide enough to hold anything. The light, hard, white, unsentimental, bleaches distance until it seems like you could walk forever and never arrive anywhere. The air has that mineral edge, sun on stone, and when the wind comes, it carries the smell of juniper and dust and something faintly metallic, like old wire warming in the heat. The brush stays low, keeping its secrets near the ground, and the ground itself is a kind of book, if you know how to read it, draws cut by flash floods, shallow arroyos that look asleep until the sky opens, scattered basalt and caliche, the bones of an ancient violence that happened before any man wrote his name on a deed. They call it Zorro Ranch now, or they did for a time. And people hear that and think of a masked swordsman, drama, legend, a flourish of cape and blade. But Zorro is just Spanish for fox, a small animal that lives by keeping out of sight. A survivor, a thief of eggs, a ghost with a heartbeat. And long before the tabloids ever got their hooks in this name, long before the place became a noun, people said with a lowered voice, It had another name, an older, straighter name that sounded like the region itself, Rancho de San Rafael. Saint names have a way of laundering the violence of history into something you can print on a sign. If you want the origin story, you start before the money and the locks and the headlines. You start with lines on paper that were drawn long before anyone stood at that gate with a state badge and a clipboard. New Mexico became a state in 1912, and with statehood came the American habit of dividing land like a ledger. Survey lines, townships, sections. A grid laid over desert and mountain with the confidence of men who believed geometry could tame anything. Each section, 1 square mile, 640 acres, became a unit of meaning, and in that grid were the school lands, the trust lands, pieces set aside not for beauty or grazing or solitude, but for revenue, for classrooms and chalk and teachers' wages, the public interest broken into rectangles out where this ranch sits, roughly 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe. Depending on how you measure a place that doesn't want measuring, the grid matters. Because the land isn't just one clean block of private property like the brochures promise. It's a patchwork. Deeded ground stitched alongside public ground, state trust parcels embedded like hidden coins. Not a romantic wilderness, but a working mosaic of ownership, where a fence line can be both boundary and argument, where a man can own the view and lease the valley, where the phrase private ranch sits on top of a deeper truth, that even the most private empires in the West often rest partly on public dirt. And that's not a technicality. It's the whole story in miniature. If you take 622 acres and you do the plain math, it comes out to just under 12 square miles, about 11.9, if you're the kind of person who still believes numbers can make something understandable. 12 square miles is big enough that weather happens differently at one end than the other, big enough that a sound can die inside it, big enough that a man can stand on the north edge and feel like he's alone, while people at the south edge might be within shouting distance of a different life entirely and never know it. This isn't prairie flat country. It's high desert with structure, ridges and shelves, sudden drops and hidden pockets. There's a line out there that locals talk about like it's a landmark and a warning, a dark dike of rock cutting across the landscape, a natural spine that stands up against the softer earth around it. In places, it becomes a cliff line, a wall you didn't build but can certainly use. It's the sort of geology that makes a property feel like a compound before you've even poured concrete. It's the earth doing security work for free. And water? Always water. In ranch country, water isn't scenery. It's authority. It's the difference between land you can hold and land that holds you at arm's length. Out here, rain comes in moods. It can vanish for weeks, leaving the ground cracked and the grass thin as hair, and then arrive all at once in a violent outburst, turning dry channels into brown knives of runoff. The old ranchers understood that. They didn't talk about amenities. They talked about wells, windmills, tanks, the distance between them, the way a trough can dictate where cattle will live and where they will die. So when people say the ranch was just empty desert, what they really mean is it wasn't easy. It didn't offer itself up gently. It required infrastructure. And infrastructure requires money and labor and time. Even before the mansion and the guest houses and the runway, the land demanded a certain kind of seriousness. Fence posts don't set themselves. Roads don't cut themselves through caliche. A ranch doesn't become a ranch because somebody liked the view. It becomes a ranch because somebody made it submit to use. But here's the other truth the myths won't mention. Land like this sits close enough to Santa Fe to be valuable in a way that has nothing to do with cattle. Close enough that the capital's orbit reaches it. Close enough that the right buyer can have distance without exile. 30 miles is nothing in the West. 30 miles is a half hour if the road is kind. 30 miles is a private world that can still be supplied, still be visited, still be governed if anyone chooses to try. And that choice is the hinge. By the late 20th century, by the 1980s into the early 1990s, this part of New Mexico was already living through a quiet economic shift that happens all over the American West. Ranching still existed, yes, but it was increasingly surrounded by other kinds of value. Land as investment, land as privacy, land as a second home, land as the physical expression of wealth. The old economy measured a place by what it produced: calves, hay, grazing leases, water. The new economy measured it by what it prevented: neighbors, oversight, noise, intrusion. That's when the word ranch starts to change meaning. A working ranch is an argument with nature you fight every day. A modern ranch, for certain men, is a title, a costume, a legal container for a different purpose. It says livestock and solitude, even if what it really means is distance and control. And in that era, the paperwork becomes the first act. Deeds, titles, leases, trust arrangements, names that aren't names. Not yet, those come later, but the system is already in place. The checkerboard ownership, the state parcels, the way you can lease public land and make it feel private simply by surrounding it. The way you can stand at a gate and say, with a straight face, that you own what you don't own because you control access to it. So the origin story of this place isn't a handshake or a folk tale. It's a map, a surveyor's grid, a statehood year, 1912, etched into the logic of the land. It's a set of lines that made it possible decades later for a man to buy a kingdom and for the kingdom to be larger than the deed alone. It's the West as it really is, not wild, not free, but parceled, administered, and quietly vulnerable to anyone who understands how to work the seams. And the seam is this: in America, land can be both public and unreachable. The law can own it, and money can control it. The myth says the frontier is gone. The reality is the frontier just learned accounting. So ask yourself, when a place like this gets renamed and repurposed, when it becomes a symbol of secrecy instead of a working spread, was that an accident of one man's taste? Or was it always waiting for the right kind of buyer, someone who didn't want the land for what it could grow, but for what it could hide? They say it began as nobody's land, a forgotten patch of high desert that sat out there doing nothing but growing sage and waiting for rain. That's the romance people like. America as empty canvas, a man stepping into it with nothing but grit and vision. But the truth is colder and older. This ground was never empty. It was simply quiet. And quiet land doesn't mean unclaimed land. It means land claimed so long ago, the claiming has turned into paperwork and habit. Stand there, and you can feel how the place tricks the eye. The horizon looks wide enough to hold anything. The light, hard, white, unsentimental, bleaches distance until it seems like you could walk forever and never arrive anywhere. The air has that mineral edge, sun on stone. And when the wind comes, it carries the smell of juniper and dust and something faintly metallic, like old wire warming in the heat. The brush stays low, keeping its secrets near the ground, and the ground itself is a kind of book if you know how to read it. Draws cut by flash floods, shallow arroyos that look asleep until the sky opens, scattered basalt and caliche, the bones of an ancient violence that happened before any man wrote his name on a deed. They call it Zorro Ranch now, or they did for a time, and people hear that and think of a masked swordsman, drama, legend, a flourish of cape and blade. But Zorro is just Spanish for fox, a small animal that lives by keeping out of sight, a survivor, a thief of eggs, a ghost with a heartbeat, and long before the tabloids ever got their hooks in this name, long before the place became a noun, people said with a lowered voice, it had another name, an older, straighter name that sounded like the region itself, Rancho de San Rafael. Saint names have a way of laundering the violence of history into something you can print on a sign. If you want the origin story, you start before the money and the locks and the headlines. You start with lines on paper that were drawn long before anyone stood at that gate with a state badge and a clipboard. New Mexico became a state in 1912, and with statehood came the American habit of dividing land like a ledger. Survey lines, townships, sections. A grid laid over desert and mountain with the confidence of men who believed geometry could tame anything. Each section, 1 square mile, 40 acres, became a unit of meaning. And in that grid were the school lands, the trust lands, pieces set aside not for beauty or grazing or solitude, but for revenue, for classrooms and chalk and teachers' wages. The public interest, broken into rectangles. Out where this ranch sits, roughly 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe, depending on how you measure a place that doesn't want measuring, the grid matters. Because the land isn't just one clean block of private property like the brochures promise. It's a patchwork. Deeded ground stitched alongside public ground, state trust parcels embedded like hidden coins. Not a romantic wilderness, but a working mosaic of ownership, where a fence line can be both boundary and argument, where a man can own the view and lease the valley, where the phrase private ranch sits on top of a deeper truth, that even the most private empires in the West often rest partly on public dirt. And that's not a technicality. It's the whole story in miniature. If you take 7,620 acres and you do the plain math, it comes out to just under 12 square miles, about 11.9. If you're the kind of person who still believes numbers can make something understandable. 12 square miles is big enough that weather happens differently at one end than the other. Big enough that a sound can die inside it. Big enough that a man can stand on the north edge and feel like he's alone, while people at the south edge might be within shouting distance of a different life entirely and never know it. This isn't prairie flat country. It's high desert with structure, ridges and shelves, sudden drops and hidden pockets. There's a line out there that locals talk about like it's a landmark and a warning, a dark dike of rock cutting across the landscape, a natural spine that stands up against the softer earth around it. In places, it becomes a cliff line, a wall you didn't build but can certainly use. It's the sort of geology that makes a property feel like a compound before you've even poured concrete. It's the earth doing security work for free. And water. Always water. In ranch country, water isn't scenery, it's authority. It's the difference between land you can hold and land that holds you at arm's length. Out here, rain comes in moods. It can vanish for weeks. leaving the ground cracked and the grass thin as hair, and then arrive all at once in a violent outburst, turning dry channels into brown knives of runoff. The old ranchers understood that. They didn't talk about amenities. They talked about wells, windmills, tanks, the distance between them, the way a trough can dictate where cattle will live and where they will die. So when people say the ranch was just empty desert, what they really mean is it wasn't easy. It didn't offer itself up gently. It required infrastructure, and infrastructure requires money and labor and time. Even before the mansion and the guest houses and the runway, the land demanded a certain kind of seriousness. Fence posts don't set themselves. Roads don't cut themselves through caliche. A ranch doesn't become a ranch because somebody liked the view. It becomes a ranch because somebody made it submit to use. But here's the other truth the myths won't mention. Land like this sits close enough to Santa Fe to be valuable in a way that has nothing to do with cattle, close enough that the capital's orbit reaches it, close enough that the right buyer can have distance without exile. 30 miles is nothing in the West. 30 miles is a half hour if the road is kind. 30 miles is a private world that can still be supplied, still be visited, still be governed, if anyone chooses to try. And that choice is the hinge. By the late 20th century, by the 1980s into the early 1990s, this part of New Mexico was already living through a quiet economic shift that happens all over the American West. Ranching still existed, yes, but it was increasingly surrounded by other kinds of value. Land as investment, land as privacy, land as a second home, land as the physical expression of wealth. The old economy measured a place by what it produced: calves, hay, grazing leases, water. The new economy measured it by what it prevented: neighbors, oversight, noise, intrusion. That's when the word ranch starts to change meaning. A working ranch is an argument with nature you fight every day. A modern ranch, for certain men, is a title, a costume, a legal container for a different purpose. It says livestock and solitude, even if what it really means is distance and control. And in that era, the paperwork becomes the first act. Deeds, titles, leases, trust arrangements, names that aren't names. Not yet, those come later, but the system is already in place. The checkerboard ownership, the state parcels, the way you can lease public land and make it feel private simply by surrounding it. The way you can stand at a gate and say, with a straight face, that you own what you don't own because you control access to it. So the origin story of this place isn't a handshake or a folk tale. It's a map, a surveyor's grid, a statehood year 1912, etched into the logic of the land. It's a set of lines that made it possible decades later for a man to buy a kingdom and for the kingdom to be larger than the deed alone. It's the West, as it really is, not wild, not free, but parceled, administered, and quietly vulnerable to anyone who understands how to work the seams. And the seam is this: in America, land can be both public and unreachable. The law can own it, and money can control it. The myth says the frontier is gone. The reality is the frontier just learned accounting. So, ask yourself, when a place like this gets renamed and repurposed, when it becomes a symbol of secrecy instead of a working spread, was that an accident of one man's taste? Or was it always waiting for the right kind of buyer? Someone who didn't want the land for what it could grow, but for what it could hide. They'll tell you he bought it because he loved the West, because he wanted a place where the night was still dark and the sky still had teeth. They'll tell you a rich man comes to the desert like a pilgrim seeking quiet, seeking himself. It makes a clean story, a sentimental one, but the truth is colder, and it begins the way most American empires begin. Not with a horse, not with a rifle, not with a sunrise, with paper. That year matters because it sits right on the hinge of the modern West when ranch country is still ranch country, but it's also becoming something else. The state is still full of men who know the smell of a wet saddle blanket, but the money coming in is money that smells like carpeted offices and cooled air. The buyer is not a man with calluses and a herd count in his head. He is a man with bankers, with attorneys, with entities that can hold a thing at arm's length and never blink. And somewhere, maybe in Santa Fe, maybe in Albuquerque, maybe in a conference room off a hallway that always smells faintly of toner, there is a closing. Not the romantic kind, the kind where the windows don't open, where the light is even and cruel, where the coffee has been sitting long enough to turn bitter and thin, a table polished to look trustworthy, a stack of documents thick enough to suggest permanence. This is how land changes hands in America when it changes hands to people who already have everything, quietly, efficiently, with witnesses whose names will never matter to the story. The number gets spoken, about $12 million. Not a poetic number, not a symbolic number, just a number that tells you the buyer isn't gambling. He's placing weight. $12 million in 1993 is not a whim, it's intent. And the acreage gets spoken too because acreage is how the West counts power. 7,122 acres say it's slow and you can feel the size of it. 12 square miles of high desert, give or take. A kingdom that doesn't need walls because it has distance. But the deeded land is only one layer. The West is never just one clean story of ownership. It's always layers, checkerboards, jurisdictions. A man can own the bones of a place and still need to lease its muscle. Out there, stitched into the ranch's footprint, there's public land, state trust land, ground meant to serve a public purpose, meant to generate revenue for schools and institutions. And within this story, there is a hard, specific number that refuses to be romantic. 1,243 acres of it. 1,243 acres that belong to the people in theory, but in practice sit behind the same fences, under the same sky of control. The state leases it out, because the state does what states do. It monetizes, it signs, it collects. There's a quiet perversity in that arrangement. The land is public, but the access isn't. The dirt belongs to everyone, but the gate belongs to whoever can afford to keep it locked. That's not a glitch. That's a feature of how the modern West runs, public resources braided into private empires, and everybody pretending the braid isn't there. And the buyer, he understands systems, he understands seams, because he doesn't buy it as a man buys a home. He buys it the way a corporation buys an asset. He buys it the way a strategist buys terrain. This is where the story's first real sin sits. Not in any single act that can be photographed, but in the structure itself, the way the land is held, the way responsibility is made to blur. You start seeing names that aren't names. Trusts, companies, paper shells that exist to absorb consequences. One name in the orbit of this place is Zorro Trust, a title that sounds playful until you realize what a trust really is. A legal animal built for endurance, built to outlive the man, built to hold the thing even after the hands that bought it are gone. Later, other names float up, Cypress Inc., and the like. Corporate skins a property can wear while the ground underneath stays the same, and in those names is a philosophy. If you can't be reached, you can't be held. Think about what a ranch is supposed to be. Traditionally, it's a working arrangement between man and weather. You run cattle, you mend fence, you count calves, you pray for rain. The land is hard but honest in its own way. It tells you the truth every morning. But this buyer, he is not coming with cattle, not with a herd count, not with a generational story about a grandfather who rode this range. He is coming with a different kind of livestock. Lawyers, accountants, managers, intermediaries, people whose work is not to raise animals, but to raise distance. And that distance begins immediately, because once the ink dries, the ranch doesn't become more public. It becomes less knowable, less touchable. The very act of purchase becomes an act of withdrawal. The property is no longer a place out by Stanley, no longer that spread southeast of Santa Fe. It becomes a contained world, a parcel in a portfolio, a place whose purpose is defined by the fact that it can be closed. Even the name starts doing work. Zorro Ranch, Fox Ranch, a grin on a sign, a little theatrical. But a fox is not a creature of open range. A fox is a creature of edges and shadows. It lives by slipping between the structures other animals accept, and that's the real origin story. Not a cowboy tale, not a handshake, not a man falling in love with a view. It's an acquisition, a calculated one. $12 million laid down to buy 12 square miles of silence. A lease stitched in. 143 acres of public trust land folded into the private envelope. A set of corporate names built like masks, each one designed to keep the world at one more remove. And when you picture it, when you picture that quiet closing in 1993, the papers spread like a small blizzard across a table, the pen moving steadily, the signatures repeating like a ritual, you start to understand something brutal about American power. It doesn't always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with stationery. Sometimes the conquest is clean. Sometimes the takeover is polite. Sometimes the frontier doesn't end. It just gets incorporated. And once the land is held that way, once it's owned not by a person but by a structure, then the next step becomes almost inevitable. Because what do you do with a kingdom of scrub and sky if you didn't come for cattle? Do you leave it raw and honest, just wind and rock and fences? Or do you start pouring concrete and building a house big enough to make the desert feel like it belongs to you? They'll tell you the house rose out of the desert like some old New Mexico dream, adobe romance, a hacienda on a hill, a rich man's tribute to history and sky. They'll tell you it was craftsmanship and taste, but the truth is the desert doesn't accept dreams. It accepts only what you can drag out there on a truck, what you can bolt to bedrock, what you can pay men to lift in the heat. The truth is, concrete and rebar and diesel exhaust hanging low in the morning air. In the late 1990s, the ranch is still new in its ownership, still settling into the hands that bought it in 1993 for about $12 million. The deed is quiet, the fences are up, the acreage is what it is, 7,122 acres of high desert stitched together with the old Western trick of control by boundary, but land alone is not enough, not for men who don't come to the West to work it. For that kind of man, land is just the stage. The real move is building. And so you picture the first mornings, not cinematic, just practical. A pale strip of dawn on the eastern edge of the sky. The air cold enough to make you pull your collar up. Cold enough that breath shows for a minute and then vanishes. The smell is creosote and dust and the faint sharpness of juniper. Somewhere a generator coughs to life, that ugly, steady sound that tells you the modern world has arrived. Surveyors first, because that's how control begins. Stakes in the ground, string lines, a man with a clipboard and a level squinting toward a point in the distance. The desert doesn't look like it wants to be measured, but it gets measured anyway. The future house is not imagined, it's outlined. Corners marked. The footprint drawn on the earth like a claim. Then the grading, heavy equipment moving slow, blade pushing soil and rock into shape. Caliche fighting back. Dust rising in a thick plume, coating tongues and eyelashes, getting into everything that breathes. You can taste it. Chalky, mineral. The flavor of ground that's been waiting a long time to be disturbed. The machines leave tracks that look like scars, and the scars crisscross where the living room will be, where the kitchen will be, where some hallway will run that nobody but staff will walk. A ranch like this sits far enough out to feel alone, but not so far that you can't supply it. That's the secret formula. Close enough to Santa Fe to be serviced, far enough to be insulated. 30 miles southeast of town, give or take. Close enough that trucks can run in and out. Far enough that no one just passes by. And building a place that's meant to last, building something as large as this, turns the ranch into a small temporary city. The desert starts seeing traffic it didn't ask for. Flatbeds hauling lumber, box trucks carrying wiring and fixtures, cement mixers rumbling down that private road, rocking on the washboards, their drums turning like a slow, indifferent heartbeat. A convoy of materials, each delivery a reminder that wealth is not magic. It's logistics. It's scheduling. It's men with radios. It's invoices. It's somebody somewhere calling to ask why a shipment's late, and somebody else saying the road's rough, and the gate's locked, and the driver didn't have the code. And the workers, always the workers. You don't get a 26,700 square foot house in the middle of high desert by wishing for it. You get it by paying people to show up when the sun is already mean and the wind has started to rise. Men and women who drive out before dawn, who eat lunch in the shade of a truck door, who go home with dust in the creases of their hands and concrete in their boots. The brochures never name them. The legends never name them. But they are the ones who translate money into walls. By 1909, the main residence is going up. Hacienda style, they call it, a word meant to invoke old world dignity while ignoring the old world labor that made haciendas run. The shape of the thing begins to assert itself against the sky. Foundation poured, walls rising, beams set. You can hear hammers from far off, little metal ticks carried on the wind, swallowed and returned. The building grows in phases, as all big buildings do. First ugly, then awkward, then suddenly undeniable. Inside it, there are rooms that will never know quiet again once the place is finished. Long corridors that make footsteps sound important. Doors that close with authority. Windows framing the desert like art you own. Out there, the landscape becomes decor. 7,722 acres of it, a horizon as private property. And if you do the math in your head, that square footage, 26,700, starts to feel obscene in its exactness. Not just large, not sprawling, a number, a measurement, a declaration. And all of it depends on the unromantic necessities: water, power, waste. In ranch country, water decides what's possible. And in mansion country, water decides what's comfortable. Wells drilled or water-hauled, storage tanks set, pumps installed, pipes laid where the ground doesn't want to yield, septic systems engineered to behave like the desert isn't the desert, electricity run through conduit, circuits planned, panels mounted. A place like that doesn't just appear. It has organs. It has veins. It has a nervous system built by electricians crawling through spaces nobody will ever see. You can imagine the heat by midday, the sun high and flat, no mercy in it, sweat drying almost as soon as it forms, throats raw, gloves stiff with dust, a foreman calling out measurements, the language of construction, square, plumb, level, trying to impose order on a world that would rather stay wild. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a man in clean clothes arrives now and then, the kind of man who doesn't carry anything heavy. He walks the site, nods, asks questions that sound like preferences rather than needs. He points at a spot and says something about a view, about a patio, about where the guests will sit. Guests. That word shows up early in projects like this. Not family, not community. Guests. Because a house like this, built in 1999, massive and deliberate, doesn't feel like a cabin a man raised to live in. It feels like a facility for receiving, for hosting, for controlling the terms of other people's presence. It has the scale of a place designed to hold more than one life at a time, multiple bedrooms, multiple buildings on the property. A ranch headquarters that isn't about cattle counts, but about movement. Who comes in, who stays, who leaves, who is seen. And while the house rises, the ranch itself begins to shift in function. It is still, on paper, a ranch. It still sits in that old grid of ownership and lease with those 1,143 acres of state trust land folded into the larger quilt. But the build changes the center of gravity. A working ranch is oriented toward pasture and water and fence. This place begins to orient toward the house, toward the compound, toward the idea that the desert is not something you contend with, but something you command. The last stages are always the quietest. Paint, tile, fixtures, the soft closing of cabinets, the click of locks being tested, the installation of systems meant to make the outside world unnecessary. When the workers finally pull away for the last time, there's a hush that settles, a hush that feels earned, and also a little sinister. A building that big sitting alone in that much space doesn't look like shelter. It looks like an answer to a question nobody asked out loud. And once it's done, once that 26,700 square foot hacienda stands there on its hill, looking out over 7,622 acres like it owns the horizon, there's only one real question left. The question the architecture itself is asking. Was it built for solitude? Or was it built for the kind of company that prefers to arrive quietly and be forgotten just as fast? They'll tell you the desert makes everybody equal, that once the sun goes down out there and the wind starts moving through the greasewood, it doesn't care if you're a ranch hand or a senator. That the stars don't bow to money. It's a good story, the kind people like to repeat when they want the West to stay pure in their minds. But the truth is, the desert doesn't make men equal. It just gives them room. And room, in the hands of the right kind of person, becomes control. Somewhere in the early 2000s, after the purchase in 1993, after the house has taken its shape by 1999, there's an evening that repeats itself in variations, again and again, like a ritual. The day has been brutally bright, and now the light is dropping off the mesas in long slanted sheets. The heat leaks out of the ground slow, like an animal letting go of its fight. Out beyond the main residence, 2700 square feet of stucco and timber and arranged comfort, 7,722 acres sit quiet and watchful. The land holding its breath the way it always does when strangers arrive. The first vehicle comes in low and deliberate, tires humming on the private road. Dust comes up behind it and hangs in the air, turning the sunset into a dirty halo. You can hear the gate long before you see the truck, metal shifting, chains sliding, that short, hard sound of a lock being handled by someone who knows the code. The vehicle doesn't hesitate. It doesn't slow the way locals slow when they're unsure of where they are. It moves like it's expected, and inside that movement is the whole difference between the myth and the real thing. This isn't a ranch where people show up with a saddle and a bedroll and ask permission to camp. This is a place where arrivals are scheduled. The staff feel it first, not in their minds, in their bodies. The timing, the tightening. The way work changes shape when the guests are not family or neighbors, but names. Linen gets pulled out. Glass gets polished until it squeaks. A long table is set in a room that stays cool even as the desert outside holds its heat, because money can buy insulation from weather and, if you do it right, insulation from consequence. Plates that match. Silver that catches the light. The soft weight of cloth napkins folded into forms that have nothing to do with ranch life. There's a smell of food that doesn't belong to this landscape. Garlic and butter and something sweet and expensive. Something shipped in with ice packs so it will still taste like the world elsewhere. The scent of mesquite smoke might drift from a grill outside, but it's curated, controlled, a little performance of the West. And then the guests begin to appear, men in clean boots that have never seen a manure pen, women in clothes chosen for indoor light, not for sun. They step out of vehicles and look around with that practiced expression people wear when they're trying to appear relaxed in a place they didn't grow up. They take in the space, the horizon, the quiet. They laugh the way city people laugh when they want to prove they can handle silence. You don't need to name them for the truth to land. It's enough to understand what kind of guests a place like this is built for. Power doesn't travel alone. It travels with assistance and schedules and the expectation that the world will move out of its way. Power travels with the belief that privacy is a right, not a privilege. And out here, 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe, close enough to reach and far enough to forget, privacy isn't just a feature, it's the product. They talk in the soft voices of people who assume no one is listening. They talk about foundations and philanthropy, about schools and science and making a difference, because those words sound good against the rawness of the land. They talk about investments and introductions, about who's meeting who next month in New York or Palm Beach or London. They talk about politics without naming it politics, the climate, the environment, what's happening in Washington. They let their sentences trail off like they're being modest, but the confidence sits under every word. They believe the future will be negotiated by people like them, in rooms like this, and the ranch itself is an accomplice. It's designed for separation. You can put guests in one building and staff in another. You can keep distance without anyone feeling like they're being guarded. On 7,922 acres, you don't need fences to keep people apart. The sheer space does the job. You can walk someone down a hallway and disappear them into a wing of the house where conversations can happen without the accidental witness of a stranger refilling a water glass. The architecture gives you choices: where to be seen, where not to be seen. There is a moment later in the evening when the sky goes fully black and the stars come out so hard and bright it almost feels aggressive. City people always react the same way. They step outside, tilt their faces up, and say something about how they forgot the world could look like this. And it's true in a shallow sense. The stars are indifferent, ancient, and gorgeous. But even that beauty becomes useful in the hands of someone who understands leverage. Awe makes people soften. Awe makes people say yes. Awe makes people feel like they're part of something bigger, something noble, when really they're just far from oversight. And somewhere in the background, always the workforce moves like shadow. Boots on gravel, a door opening and closing without a sound, a tray appearing and disappearing, the invisible labor that makes the visible luxury look effortless. The myth loves the great man in his desert refuge. The truth is, the refuge is held up by people whose names will never be spoken into a microphone. Outside the circle of light, the land keeps its own counsel. The state trust acres, 1,243 of them, sit in the dark just like the private ground does, indifferent to the fact that they belong, in theory, to the public good. The legal fiction holds public land, private access. That contradiction doesn't come up at dinner. It never does. Contradictions rarely do. When the people at the table benefit from them and the night moves forward in small, expensive increments, glass refilled, laughter rising, then falling, someone stepping away to take a call in a quiet corner, voice low, face lit by a screen. Someone else leaning close to whisper a name, a number, a promise. The desert wind runs along the walls outside and finds no cracks to get in. By the time the guests drift toward their rooms, or toward whatever part of the property has been arranged for them, the ranch has done its work. It has taken powerful people and placed them in a world where the rules feel optional, where the distance makes everything seem less real, where the soft dark feels like permission. And that's the unsettling hinge of it. If you can gather power in a place like this, if you can host in a kingdom measured in acres and square footage and silence, then the next question isn't who you invited. The next question is how you keep it supplied, how you bring in the food and the fuel and the staff and the guests themselves, again and again, without the outside world ever quite noticing what's moving through the gate or dropping onto the land. They'll tell you remoteness is a kind of purity, that if a place is far enough from the city, it becomes honest by distance alone. But the truth is, remoteness in modern America is not a condition. It's a purchase. It's a monthly expense. It's a machine you keep fed with fuel and payroll and quiet deliveries at the right hours. Before the sun comes up, the desert is almost gentle, almost. The air is cold enough to sting the inside of your nose. The sage holds on to its smell like a secret, and the ground gives off that dry, mineral breath that feels older than language. Out there, 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe, the ranch sits with its acreage spread like a claim, 7,622 acres, almost 12 square miles of space that can swallow sound and trouble alike. 12 square miles is big, but it's not magic. It doesn't run on silence alone. Silence still has overhead. Somewhere around 5 in the morning, a truck is already moving. You can picture it without straining. Headlights cutting a thin tunnel through the dark, tires humming. The driver sipping bad coffee and doing the math in his head. Time, miles, gate code, where to turn off, what to say if someone asks questions at a gas station, a supply run doesn't look like a crime. That's the beauty of it. A supply run looks like America being America. Goods moving along roads, money turning into objects, objects turning into comfort. And out here, comfort is a conquest. The ranch has a main house that was built up by 1999, about 26 or 700 square feet of roofline and rooms and corridors, an interior world meant to ignore the exterior truth of heat and wind. But a house that size is a creature. It consumes. It needs water, power, propane, food, replacement parts, bulbs, filters, paint, soap, linen, and people to make all of it feel invisible. Even a simple problem out here becomes logistics. A broken pump isn't a quick trip to the hardware store. It's a call, a drive, a gate, a man with tools, and a receipt. And then there's the land itself. 7,622 acres. If it were a perfect square, you'd need nearly 14 miles of fence just to draw the outline. 14 miles of posts that rot and lean, wire that snaps, corners that loosen, gates that sag. The desert isn't sentimental about man-made boundaries. It works on them every day. Sun checking the wood, wind sanding the paint, flash floods undercutting the roadbed when the sky decides it's time. A place like this doesn't stay neat by accident. It stays neat because somebody is paid to fight entropy. That's the part the myth skips. People want the ranch to be a static image, the big house, the open range, the quiet. But it's dynamic. It's motion. It's scheduled maintenance and emergency fixes and deliveries timed so the wrong eyes don't see too much. And the airstrip, there's always an airstrip in stories like this. Not a runway with lights and a tower and a kid selling snacks. A grass airstrip. A strip cut into the earth like a private signature. The kind you keep mowed and rolled. The kind you walk before a landing because gopher holes can kill a plane as fast as any storm. Out there, grass isn't decoration. Grass is infrastructure. It's something you maintain with the same seriousness you maintain a lock. A grass airstrip changes the whole geometry of secrecy. Roads are accountable in their own crude way. Roads have other cars. Roads have broken-down strangers and state troopers and the occasional curious soul who takes the wrong turn and needs directions. Roads force you to exist in the same world as everybody else. Air does not. Air lets you arrive without stopping at a light. It lets you leave without a witness at a gas pump. It lets you bring people and packages in on your schedule and take them out the same way. No motel receipts, no lobby cameras, no where you headed. From a clerk who still believes small talk is harmless. Just a plane dropping out of a wide sky into private acreage, touching down on grass, rolling quiet toward a hangar that keeps the thing out of sight. And the hangar matters as much as the strip. A hangar is a mouth that closes. It swallows evidence of movement. It turns arrival into absence. So you picture another morning. Sun coming up now, hard and clean, the light turning every rock sharp. The wind is up early, small gusts kicking dust into little spirals that dance and collapse. A pickup sits near the strip. Someone has walked the length of the runway. You can see the footprints in the dew-dark grass. Someone is looking down, not at the sky, but at the ground, scanning for the tiny hazards the desert makes in the night. A rock, a hole, a torn patch where rain cut a shallow channel. The inspection is quiet and methodical, the kind of work nobody sees because it's meant to prevent drama. And then the sound comes in, the engine note, distant at first, then swelling. The plane approaches, and there's a moment where it hangs against the sky like a thought you can't get rid of. It lines up, It drops. It touches the ground with a brief shudder you can feel even if you're standing 100 yards away. Wheels on grass, a slow roll. The wind carries the smell of fuel, sharp and chemical, cutting through juniper and dust. This is the ranch's real bloodstream. Not the romantic open range, but the practical circulation of modern life. Fuel in, food in, bodies out, waste handled, problem solved. It is not isolation. It is controlled access. And that control extends beyond the deeded lines. The ranch isn't a single, cleanly private thing. Woven into it is public land. 1,543 acres of state trust land, leased and folded into the same functional enclosure. That number sits there like a moral splinter, public ground, private field. The state owns it on paper, but on the ground it's accessed through the same gates, along the same roads, inside the same envelope of control. That arrangement doesn't just save money. It expands the illusion. It gives the property more room than the deed alone can claim. So when people talk about a remote ranch, what they're really describing is a system. A purchase distance supported by infrastructure, a place that cost about $12 million to acquire in 1993, then demanded more money to become what it was meant to be. By 1999, a mansion of 20,700 square feet, standing over 7,722 acres, with a grass airstrip nearby like a private artery to the outside world. And the system only works if it stays quiet, if the deliveries are routine, if the arrivals look normal, if every moving piece, truck, plane, gate, generator, well pump, fence line, does what it's supposed to do without drawing attention, which leaves you with the question that always waits beneath the architecture and the acreage. If a kingdom like this runs on logistics and controlled movement, then who are the people paid to keep the machine alive? And what do they see? And what do they carry home with them when the day is done? They say a ranch runs on cattle and weather, that it's men on horseback and fences stretching toward the horizon, and the rest is just poetry. But the truth is, a place like this runs on people you never see, people who show up before sunrise, people who don't get photographed, people whose names aren't stitched into the legend because the legend can't afford to admit how many hands it needs to stay standing. You can start at 5 a.m. when the desert is still cold enough to feel honest. The sky is that thin gray that makes everything look unfinished. The air tastes like dust that hasn't been kicked up yet, and the sage gives off its sharp medicinal smell when you brush past it. A pickup moves along the private road with its lights off because the driver knows it by memory now. Every rut, every washboard patch, every place the road dips and rises like a long, tired spine. He's not driving out there to admire the sunrise. He's driving out there because the main house, about 2,600 square feet of rooms and corridors built up by 1999, doesn't wake up on its own. A building that size is a living thing. It needs heat when the nights get cold. It needs filters changed. It needs water pressure. It needs locks tested. It needs the trash hauled out before it starts to smell like the truth. And the ranch itself, 7,620 acres, nearly 12 square miles, doesn't take care of itself either. Fence lines sag, gates warp, flash floods cut roads overnight like a razor. The wind will worry a hinge loose the way it worries a dead branch loose. Out here, neglect shows fast, not because the land judges you, but because the land is always trying to erase you. The first work is always the unglamorous work. Check the generator, check the well, walk the grass airstrip if you've got one, because a rock in the wrong place can turn a quiet landing into a funeral. Look for fresh tire tracks you didn't expect. Look for prints near the gate. Out on 12 square miles, you learn that the desert is a ledger. It records everything for a little while in dust and sand before it wipes itself clean again. Inside the house, the staff moves like a separate weather system. Doors opening without a sound, lights coming on in rooms that haven't been used in weeks. A housekeeper running a cloth over surfaces no one will touch today, because cleanliness isn't about use. It's about readiness. Ready for the guests, ready for the owner, ready for the phone call that says, they're coming. And there is always that feeling under all of it, that the ranch is a stage kept in perfect order for a performance that may or may not happen on any given night. That's what wealth buys out here, not comfort exactly, but preparedness. The world can arrive at your door and you can make it look like you were expecting it. The workers learn the rhythms. They learn the language that matters. Not poetry, logistics, deliveries, schedules. Who needs what, where things go, which rooms are off limits, which doors stay locked even when nobody's there. They learn that the land is more than the deeded acres, that there are parcels within the larger footprint that belong to the state. 243 acres of trust land, public ground leased and folded into private control. Maybe they don't talk about it in those terms, but they understand it in their bones. There's the law on paper, and there's the reality on the ground, and the reality is the gate. Somebody on staff handles the mail and the invoices and the quiet bureaucracy of the place. They see company names that don't sound like people, trusts, corporations, titles that exist to own without being owned back. When the property changes hands on paper, the work on the ground stays the same. Keep it running, keep it quiet, keep it ready, and quiet costs the most, because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the absence of witnesses. It's the careful management of who comes and goes. Staff become the human locks on the place. They know which vehicles belong. They know which faces are familiar. They know when a guest arrives with too much confidence for someone who's never worked the land. They know when a visitor walks the house like he's counting rooms rather than admiring them. And what do you do with what you know? Most people, if they're honest, do what people have always done under power. They take the paycheck. They keep their head down. They tell themselves they're there to work, not to judge. They go home and wash the dust off their arms and eat dinner with their families and try to leave the ranch at the ranch. Because the alternative is a kind of loneliness, too. The loneliness of being the person who speaks. The mythology of America loves the lone owner, the great man on his land, master of his fate. But the reality is, an empire is a payroll. Someone changes the sheets. Someone hauls the garbage. Someone fixes the pump when it fails. Someone fuels the vehicles. Someone checks the perimeter. Someone answers the phone until they don't. And then, one summer, the outside world starts forcing itself into the gates anyway. July 2019, the news hits like a hammer from far away and somehow still shakes the windows. The name that had floated through private conversations for years, spoken softly, laughed off, treated like a rumor with money behind it, suddenly becomes a headline. Not gossip anymore. A date on the calendar, an arrest in the public record, and the staff feels it the way they feel a storm coming, in the pressure, in the tightening of routine, in the sudden insistence on caution. Then, August 10th, 2019, another date. Colder, final. The man at the center of the story is dead. And death does a strange thing to secrecy. It doesn't end it. It scrambles it. It makes people nervous. It makes phones ring and then stop ringing. It makes instructions change without explanation. Out at the ranch, the land doesn't react. The sage doesn't care. The wind keeps coming. But the human systems shift. The gate becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a statement. Who gets in? Who doesn't? Who is answered? Who is ignored? Because when the headlines hit, the state remembers its own paperwork. Inspectors and officials start looking at lease maps and acreage counts, and the stubborn little fact of those 1,143 public acres inside a private envelope. Calls get made. Messages get left. The polite machinery of government tries to do what it says it does. Show up, look around, account for the public interest. And the people who work the ranch are the ones standing closest to that collision. Not the owner, not the lawyers, not the trusts with their clean names. The workers, the caretakers, the hands, the ones who have to decide whether they open the gate, whether they answer the phone, whether they become the human hinge between a locked empire and the world demanding to see inside. So when the wider world finally turns its face toward those 7,622 acres, toward that 26 out of 700 square foot house, toward the least public ground buried inside it all, what happens to the people whose job has always been to keep everything running and keep everything quiet? They say an arrest is the end of a story. They say once the handcuffs click, the world exhales and the page turns. It's a comfort people reach for, justice as a clean door that closes behind the villain. But the truth is colder. An arrest doesn't end anything. It begins the paperwork. It wakes up file cabinets. It makes bureaucrats reach for old keys and old maps and try to remember what they signed off on when nobody was watching. July 2019. New Mexico is in that part of summer where the heat isn't dramatic anymore. It's just there. It sits on the shoulders of the day like a weight you don't argue with. The sky over Santa Fe is a hard blue, and the light on the stucco buildings has no softness left in it. In town, people still go about their errands. Coffee, groceries, short conversations in parking lots. But the news moves through the air like a grit you can't rinse out. The headlines have a name in them. The name carries its own gravity now. You can feel it in the way people read their phones with their brows tightened as if the screen is bright enough to burn. A man with money and a record of rumors has been arrested, July 6, 2019, and the world does what the world always does. It asks, where else? Who else? How deep? And out there, 30-some miles southeast of the capital, there's a piece of property that suddenly stops being a ranch and starts being a question mark stamped onto the desert. 7,622 acres, nearly 12 square miles. A private gate. A road that disappears inward like a sentence that won't finish. A main residence, built up by 1999, about 26,700 square feet of rooms, hallways, doors, and stitched inside the larger footprint like a quiet, humiliating detail. 243 acres of state trust land. Public ground leased into the ranch's envelope. Like the state itself accidentally tucking its own shirt into somebody else's belt. In the state land office in Santa Fe, the day is fluorescent and dry. The kind of office day where the air conditioner hums steadily and the carpet has that faint old smell of dust and printer toner. There are cubicles, there are binders, there are people who have spent their careers handling land as an abstraction, parcels, leases, renewals, compliance. Without ever standing at the gates of the empires, those documents help sustain. But now the phone calls start. Questions from reporters, questions from the public, questions from within government itself. What is this lease? What does it cover? Who signed it? When did it start? Who has the right to inspect? Who has the right to enter? In the modern West, these aren't philosophical questions. They're procedural ones, and procedure is a language bureaucracies understand. Somebody pulls the file. The lease records go back decades, back into the era when the purchase happened. 1993, about $12 million to acquire the ranch, back to the administrative beginnings when the state first agreed to rent out its trust acres to the same operation. The papers are older than the outrage. They're quiet, beige, official. The ink looks indifferent. A printer starts running, page after page. The machine's steady clatter fills the room, and the smell of hot paper blooms in the air. Someone flips through documents with a practiced thumb, checking dates, signatures, parcel numbers. A staple bites down. A binder clip snaps shut. The language is all clean. Lease, inspection, trust, terms. Words designed to sound neutral, even when they're braided into something ugly. By July 16, 2019, there are hundreds of pages, over 400 of them, stacked and organized and ready to be delivered to the Attorney General's office. 400 pages doesn't feel like much until you lift it. It has weight. It makes your wrists remember that government is not an idea. It's paper. It's what gets signed and what gets filed and what gets forgotten until the moment forgetting becomes dangerous. The person carrying the stack down the hallway isn't thinking about drama. They're thinking about logistics. Don't drop it. Don't lose a page. Don't mix up the order. The elevator smells faintly of disinfectant and somebody's cologne. The doors open, close, a short drive across town. The summer glare through the windshield. A handoff in a building that feels colder inside than it has any right to be, because the state always runs on refrigerated air and muted voices. Outside, the desert doesn't care that the state is moving paper around. Out at the ranch, the day is heat and distance. The gate sits there like it always has. The land doesn't change its posture just because the world has discovered its name. If anything, the place seems to become more itself, more silent, more withheld. There are calls, messages left, requests for access, and the responses, if they come at all, are thin. The kind of thin that tells you the decision was made elsewhere. This is where the American myth breaks down. People imagine that when something becomes news, it becomes reachable. But reach is not the same as right, and right is not the same as access. A ranch like this isn't just land. It's a system designed to make the world knock politely. Days pass, the questions get louder, the name becomes radioactive. And then, on August 10, 2019, the man at the center of it all is dead. Another date that lands like a stone. The story doesn't end. It mutates. The death turns the whole thing from prosecution into residue, from a trial that could have produced testimony into a vacuum where the only things left are documents and property and the people who were never meant to be on the record. And that's when the focus shifts, subtly, brutally, to the place, to the desert empire itself. Because if the man is gone, the structures remain, the acreage remains. The 243 acres of public trust land still sits inside the private envelope, waiting like a question the state can't afford not to ask. What does a government do when it realizes it has been renting part of itself to an empire of silence? Does it show up like a sovereign, keys in hand, authority intact? Or does it do what it always does when confronted by wealth and distance? Send letters, make calls, and hope the gate decides to open on its own? They say when the state finally decides to act, it comes like a thunderclap. Sirens, warrants, men in windbreakers stepping over thresholds with cameras rolling. That's the myth people want. Government as a fist, justice as a sudden thing. But the truth is colder and smaller. The state doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like a letter. It arrives on paper with a return address, and a clock starts ticking the moment the envelope is opened. Santa Fe, late August, bleeding into early September of 2019. The days are still hot, but the mornings have started to thin out. You can feel fall trying to edge in, the way it always does in New Mexico, quietly, without permission. The light is sharp on the mountains. The air smells like dust and pinon and sun-baked stucco. And the state is doing what states do when they're embarrassed, trying to find the edge of their own authority. Inside the state land office, the desert is kept outside by glass and air conditioning. Fluorescent lights flatten everything. The carpets have that muted office smell, cleaning solution, paper, the faint burn of warm plastic from printers that never stop. There are maps on walls, the kind with tidy lines that pretend land is a neat thing. There are file drawers full of lease numbers and parcel descriptions, and in those drawers sits a problem that suddenly has a face, because the questions won't stop now. After July 6, 2019, after the arrest, people started asking what New Mexico knew, what New Mexico did, what New Mexico allowed. And on July 16, 2019, the Land Office pushed more than 400 pages of documents to the Attorney General. Over 400 pages, all tied to one hard, humiliating fact. 143 acres of state trust land leased into the orbit of that ranch. Public ground, school ground, the people's ground, sitting behind a private gate like it's part of someone's personal kingdom. The leases go back a long way, back to the origin, back to February 22, 1993, when the state granted an agricultural lease tied to the operation, a date that reads clean on paper, a date that didn't feel sinister at the time because paperwork rarely does. In 1993, the ranch was described in round numbers that sound like legend. About 10,000 acres once you count the broader footprint and the way these places sprawl through leases and adjoining ground. It was bought with money, held with structure, and now suddenly the state has to explain why it was renting out pieces of itself to a silence that won't answer the phone. And that's where the story tightens into something almost claustrophobic. The state can't inspect what it can't access. A lease can say inspection in bold. It can talk about compliance and beneficial use and the public trust. But if the gate doesn't open, the lease becomes a prayer. There are messages left, not one, multiple. Voicemails that sit in an inbox unanswered, calls that ring and ring, into that dead quiet that feels like a choice. The state asks for access to inspect the trust land, those 243 acres, and the request is met with nothing. No yes, no no, just absence. And absence, when it's wielded by wealth, is a kind of answer. So the land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, newly in that office, suddenly holding a problem that belongs to the entire state, does what government actually does when it decides to bare its teeth. She directs staff to draft a notice. Not a raid, not a dramatic speech. A notice. Drafting a cancellation notice is a slow violence. It's a weapon made of clauses. Someone pulls the lease terms. Someone checks the rules that govern state trust land, the statutes and the regulations that don't care about headlines, but do care about procedure. Someone makes sure the dates are correct because dates are where lawsuits live. Someone writes in the phrase that matters most. You are in violation, and you have a fixed window to respond. Then the paper goes through the ritual of becoming official. It's printed on letterhead. It gets reviewed, redlined, cleaned up. The tone is careful, firm but not reckless, because the state knows it's stepping onto a field where the other side has lawyers who bill in hours, not in days. The language has to be clean enough to stand in court. It has to be cold enough to be defensible. No outrage, no poetry. Just the kind of bureaucratic certainty that says, we are taking this back. September 4th, 2019, that date matters. It's the day the state sends the cancellation notice to Cypress Inc., the corporate skin holding the lease, a company set far away on paper, the kind of entity that exists to keep a real person at a safe distance from consequence. The notice goes out, and with it, the state starts a countdown. 30 days. That's the kind of number governments love. A tidy period. A procedural mercy that makes the state look fair, even when it's trying to reclaim control. 30 days, and then the cancellation becomes effective. You can imagine the envelope. Plain, official, heavier than it looks because inside it is the state's attempt to reassert itself. You can imagine the stamp, the sorting machines, the letter traveling through ordinary channels like any other piece of mail, which is its own kind of insult. A matter this ugly moving through the same system that delivers catalogs and birthday cards. Out at the ranch, the gate doesn't creak open out of respect. The desert doesn't shift. The sage doesn't bow. The road still disappears into private land and private decisions. If anyone reads the letter inside those fences, they read it behind locked doors, under air conditioning, with lawyers on speed dial. And in Santa Fe, the land office is forced into the strange posture of government in the modern West. Powerful on paper, cautious in practice. They can cancel the leases, yes. They can say the public land will be taken back. They can plan for reassignment, for best use, for that clean language that suggests the state is now in control of its own story again. But control isn't just a memo. Control is the ability to show up. And this is what makes the moment unsettling. The state is reclaiming 1,243 acres of public trust land inside an empire of 7,922 acres, and it's doing it by mail. It's doing it through procedure. Through a 30-day fuse that burns quietly toward October 4th, 2019, the effective date when the cancellation becomes real in the eyes of the state. And even if the state wins that small piece of ground back, wins it on paper, wins it in the legal sense, the bigger question remains out there in the heat and distance, waiting like a bad smell you can't scrub out. If public land can be folded into private secrecy for decades, and then taken back only after a scandal forces the issue, what happens to the rest of the ranch when the man is gone and the property itself becomes just another asset to be sold, renamed, and moved off the books? They say land is the one thing that doesn't lie, that it sits there through wars and scandals and dead men and changing fashions, waiting for the next owner the way a river waits for rain. They'll tell you, dirt can't be guilty. They'll tell you, acreage is just acreage. But the truth is colder. Land can be poisoned without a single drop of chemical touching it. A place can become radioactive by reputation alone, and once it does, it stops being a refuge and becomes inventory, an asset with a stain, a number on a spreadsheet that nobody wants to put their signature next to. August 10th, 2009. The date lands like a bolt driven into wood. The man at the center of the noise is dead, and death does what it always does in America. It turns life into paperwork. What used to be owned becomes the estate. What used to be private becomes a matter of filings and creditors and court calendars. The West loves to talk about legacy as if it's a mountain range, solid, dignified, inevitable. But legacy, in a probate proceeding, is a folder. Somewhere in an office far from the ranch's dust, maybe in Santa Fe, maybe in New York, maybe in a place where the air smells like coffee and copier heat, there's a conference table. Not glamorous, just a table with scuffs on it and a faint ring where somebody set a mug down too often. The people around it aren't wearing spurs. They're wearing watches that cost more than a year's rent. Their voices are low and careful. They're looking at a list. The list is the dead man's world boiled down. Properties, accounts, entities, liabilities. And there, among the items, sits the desert. 7,622 acres of New Mexico high country, 30 miles southeast of Santa Fe, held inside a structure of names that aren't names. The main house, built by 1999, about 700 square feet, still standing out there in the heat like a monument to intention. A grass airstrip cut into the earth, outbuildings and guest quarters, roads that don't show up on tourist maps. And inside the ranch's footprint, the uncomfortable truth the state had already been forced to face. 143 acres of leased trust land, public ground tangled into private control like a bad knot. But the estate doesn't feel the romance of that land. The estate feels math. Because probate isn't about memory, it's about who gets paid. It's about creditors lining up like men at a water trough in drought, polite, legal, relentless. Lawyers talk about administration. Accountants talk about liquidity. The people who inherited the mess talk about exposure. And the ranch, once a fortress of quiet, becomes a question of timing. Can you sell it before the stain hardens into permanence? At first, you can imagine the impulse to hold, to wait, to hope the public turns its head, because the public always turns its head eventually. But the bills don't wait. The estate has obligations, and in America, even the most infamous property eventually gets dragged into the marketplace by necessity. So the decision gets made. List it. The year matters because it's far enough from the initial shock that people have started to develop selective amnesia, but close enough that the name still burns. A broker is brought in, the kind of person who has learned how to keep their face neutral around ugly things, because real estate in this country sells everything: beauty, tragedy, history, silence. A photographer is hired. Someone drives out to the gate with equipment in the back seat and a schedule in hand, stepping into the same high desert light that makes everything look too honest. The ranch is put on the market at $27.5 million. Say the number out loud and you can hear what it's trying to do. $27.5 million isn't just a price, it's a declaration that the land still believes in itself, that the square footage still counts, that 7,722 acres still carries authority, that the view is still worth more than the questions. But the market doesn't run on declarations. It runs on what people will actually sign. In the listing, the language does what language always does when it needs to hide a wound. It leans into romance. It leans into scale. It leans into the clean facts that can be measured: acreage, bedrooms, outbuildings, distance from Santa Fe. It talks about seclusion, like seclusion is always benign. It talks about legacy, like legacy doesn't come with lawyers. And then the calls come or don't, because a ranch like that doesn't sell like a suburban home. There are no open houses with balloons tied to the mailbox. There are vetted tours, quiet inquiries, people asking careful questions through intermediaries. And always, beneath the practical questions, water rights, maintenance, access roads, insurance, there's the thing nobody wants to say directly. Can you own this and not inherit its shadow? Time passes. The desert keeps doing what it does. Sun bleaching paint, wind worrying at fences. The house sits there consuming maintenance. The property taxes still exist. The security still costs money. And slowly, inevitably, the price begins to sag under the weight of reality. The listing drops down to $18 million. That's not just a reduction. That's an admission. It's the market telling the estate what the estate doesn't want to hear. The story is part of the property now. You can't bulldoze it. You can't repaint it. You can't rename it and pretend people won't remember. And still, even at $18 million, it doesn't move easily, because buyers at that level aren't buying shelter. They're buying identity. They're buying a narrative they can live inside. And this narrative has blood in the walls, whether anyone can prove it in court or not. It has questions in the floorboards. It has silence that feels too practiced. Then August 2023, another date that matters. The ranch sells, but the price is not disclosed because secrecy doesn't die just because ownership changes. It sells to a newly registered company, a fresh skin, a clean name designed to take the deed without taking the shame in public. The proceeds, as far as the estate is concerned, do what proceeds always do. They move toward administration, toward creditors, toward closing out obligations. The empire of secrets becomes a line item that gets zeroed out. And out at the ranch, the gate is still a gate. The air still smells like juniper and dust. The horizon still looks endless. But something fundamental has changed. It's no longer a private kingdom held by one man's will. It's a commodity that has passed hands. And with that passing comes the oldest American magic trick: turning scandal into a transaction. Which leaves the next question hanging in the heat like a vulture on a thermal. Once a place like this becomes just another listing, just another brochure of acreage and square footage and seclusion, how do you market the desert as paradise when the whole world knows what that silence might have been used for? They'll tell you the market is rational, that a piece of land is worth what it's worth, and all the noise around it is just noise, headlines that blow through like dust and settle somewhere else. They'll tell you real estate is immune to shame because shame can't be surveyed and can't be mortgaged and can't be appraised. But the truth is colder. Shame has a price, and sometimes the price is the whole reason the place won't sell. It starts the way these things always start, not out at the gate, not in the sage, not under the stars, but in an office where the air smells like toner and lemon cleaner. A broker sits at a desk with a legal pad, staring at a property whose very name makes people swallow before they speak. Somewhere nearby, There's a printer warming up, that dry mechanical whir that sounds like bureaucracy clearing its throat. The broker has sold hard properties before, divorces, foreclosures, estates where the heirs won't look each other in the eye. But this is different. This is a place that comes with a question mark attached to the deed. 2 years after the arrest in July 2019, 2 years after the death on August 10th of 2019, long enough that the initial shock has dulled into a steady, ugly recognition, short enough that nobody can pretend they didn't know, and the ranch goes on the market with a number that tries to restore dignity by sheer weight. $27.5 million. $27.5 million. Say it slow, and you can hear what it's attempting. An act of faith in acreage, in square footage, in the old American belief that land is a solvent that dissolves every sin. The marketing begins with measurement, because measurement is the cleanest language they have. They list acreage like Scripture. Depending on which set of documents you're looking at, the ranch is described different ways, because the West is always a patchwork, and the story changes with what you count. One set of numbers says 7,622 acres, nearly 12 square miles of high desert. Another, in the sales pitch, breaks it down into 7,575 deeded acres plus 423 acres leased from the Bureau of Land Management, a kind of legal frosting meant to make the footprint feel even larger, nearly 8,000 acres when you add it up. The buyer doesn't need poetry. The buyer needs certainty. So they give him numbers, then they give him rooms. They talk about the main residence, built up by 1999, about 26,700 square feet, and they talk about guest houses and outbuildings and stables and offices and the lodge-like feel of the place and the grass airstrip cut into the land like a private vein. They mention a firehouse as if it's quaint, as if it isn't also a statement. We have our own emergency services out here because we intend to be a world unto ourselves. The work of selling a place like this is not in describing what it is. It's in describing what it isn't. There are choices made with a surgeon's care, what photos get taken, what angles. The photographer arrives early because desert light can be unforgiving. And he knows the trick of it, how the first hour after sunrise can make stucco glow and shadows soften and everything look like it was built for beauty instead of control. He walks the rooms with a wide-angle lens, capturing the vaulted ceilings, the thick walls, the clean lines that say Southwest luxury to anyone who wants to hear it. They open windows to let in air that smells like juniper and dust and stone warmed by sun. They wipe fingerprints off glass. They turn on lamps that make the interior look warm, inhabited, normal. They stage the kitchen like the house host's family dinners instead of secrecy. They set out bowls, fruit, maybe, because fruit is a lie people understand. They place a throw blanket over a couch like someone might curl up there with a book and a conscience. Outside, they frame the land as romance. A sweep of desert, a horizon that goes on and on, the kind of emptiness money can buy and then call peace. The listing language leans hard into words that sound innocent until you put them next to the history: secluded, private, retreat. Legacy. The ranch is described the way America likes to describe itself: limitless, untamed, pure, while the gate stays locked and the world keeps asking what that privacy was used for. And then come the legal conversations that never show up in the brochure. Disclosure is a strange creature. In ordinary home sales, it's about water damage and termites and whether the roof leaks. Here, the leak isn't in the roof. It's in the story. The broker and the lawyers talk about what must be said, what can be omitted, what will inevitably surface in due diligence. The buyers at $27.5 million don't show up with a pre-approval letter and a dream. They show up with attorneys and private investigators and their own fear of association. They ask not just about wells and septic and road maintenance, but about reputational risk, though they won't call it that out loud. They'll phrase it like they're talking about community sentiment, public attention, ongoing matters. Clean words again. A tour's arranged, but it's not a tour the way normal people mean tour. It's scheduled. It's controlled. The buyer's vehicle comes through the gate and drives a private road that disappears into acreage and silence. The desert looks the same as it always does, sun, brush, distance, but now it's being evaluated, not admired, priced. The buyer steps into the main house and hears the quiet. A quiet you can't get in a city. The air inside is cool, even when the day outside is brutal, because comfort is engineered here. He walks rooms that echo. He looks out windows that turn the landscape into artwork. He asks questions about the airstrip, about how quickly you can get in and out, about access, about control. He asks about the deeded acres and the leased acres, about boundaries, about what the public can see. He is not shopping for cattle country. He is shopping for separation. And then he leaves, and after he leaves, the broker sits back down with the same legal pad and hears the silence in a different way, the silence of a deal that doesn't happen. Time does what it always does. It turns the urgent into the expensive. Maintaining a place like this costs money every day it sits unsold. Insurance, security, upkeep. The land itself doesn't care, but the systems do. Filters clog, pipes age, paint fades. The desert works on everything patient as hunger, so the price drops. From $27.5 million down to $18 million. That reduction is not just economics. It's an acknowledgement. It's the market speaking in its only honest language. This is what the stain cost. This is what the name costs. This is what silence costs when it stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling complicit. And still, even at $18 million, the ranch resists the ordinary flow of commerce. Because some properties don't just sell land, they sell association. They sell a story the buyer must agree to carry. So the question becomes less about acreage and more about alchemy. How do you turn a place the world associates with one kind of darkness into a place that can be spoken about at a dinner table without the room going quiet? Do you keep lowering the price until someone bites? Or do you do what America always does when the truth won't sell, change the name on the gate and call it something older, cleaner, almost holy? They say a name is just a label, that you can scrape one off and nail another up, and the land beneath won't know the difference. They say places don't have souls. They say renaming is renewal, the way a man might change shirts after a long, dirty day and pretend the work never touched him. But the truth is colder. A new name isn't a fresh start. It's an attempt to change what comes up when people go looking. It's an attempt to rearrange memory the way you rearrange furniture. Same room, different angles, hoping the shadows fall kinder. You can see it in the way it happens. Not in speeches, not in announcements, but in quiet clerical motions that add up to disappearance. Start with the paper again, because this story always starts with paper. A deed doesn't have emotions. A deed doesn't blush. It just moves. August 2023. The sale goes through, After the long, awkward year of listing language and price cuts, after the ranch has sat with its stain under the bright New Mexico sun, after it's been offered at $27.5 million and then sagged down toward $18 million like a confession, the buyer is not a person in public view. The buyer is a newly registered company, a fresh legal skin. The price isn't spoken out loud, not in any way the public can easily grasp, because concealment is one of the amenities that comes with this kind of transaction. And then the first real work begins, the work of making the place look like it never had that other name. At the gate, someone takes a wrench to bolts that have held a sign in place through years of wind and dust. The metal is hot by mid-morning. Even the shade out there feels thin. The bolts squeal when they turn, reluctant, gritty with sand. The sign comes loose, and for a moment it's just a piece of painted material with letters on it. Nothing mystical, nothing permanent. But it carries weight because it carried permission. It told people who this place was. They take it down. Maybe it gets stored in a shed. Maybe it gets thrown out. Maybe it gets burned in a barrel somewhere. The smoke slipping into the same sky that never testifies. However it's done, the outcome is the same. You remove the word that became poison, and then you reach for an older word, an older identity, something that sounds rooted, historical, harmless. Rancho de San Rafael. Say it slow, and it sounds like a prayer, like tradition, like a place that predates scandal, as if age itself can cleanse. It's the kind of name that feels like it belongs on a map, not in a headline. It has the saint in it. It has the language of the region in it. It suggests continuity, not rupture. And in a way, it's truthful, because that name was there before the modern notoriety. But it's also a trick, because pulling an old name forward doesn't change what happened under the newer one. It only changes how quickly strangers connect the dots. The ranch's address doesn't change its bones either. The numbers stay stubborn. The acreage is still the acreage, 7,622 acres in the old count, nearly 12 square miles of desert that can swallow a question whole. In the marketing language, the pieces can be arranged differently. 7,575 deeded acres plus 423 leased acres, the kind of math that turns land into a larger, cleaner story. But the dirt doesn't care what brochure arithmetic calls it. The dirt only knows footsteps and tires and time. And the house is still there. About 26,500 square feet, built up by 1999, sitting in its position like a judgment that can't be appealed. You can repaint stucco. You can swap fixtures. You can replace locks. But you can't unbuild scale. The house announces itself, no matter what you call the property. It is a monument to the idea that distance can be owned. The renaming bleeds outward, not just the sign at the gate, the stationery, the invoices, the way contractors are told what to write on their work orders, the way a delivery driver is instructed on which name to say if he gets lost and asks a stranger for directions, the way local talk shifts reluctantly, like a tongue testing a new word. Because locals, real locals, don't rename places as easily as corporations do. They remember. They call things what they called them when they were young. They call them what their parents called them. A place out by Stanley doesn't become something else just because a new LLC files a form. But the official world is different. The official world obeys paper. County records, state records, corporate registries. Those are the scriptures of modern ownership. And once the documents carry the new name becomes real in the places that matter for money. That's the point. A name isn't for the coyotes or the wind. A name is for banks, for insurers, for future buyers, for journalists searching databases, for curious people typing into a search bar at midnight. You rename the property because you want the friction of discovery to increase. You want the world to have to work harder to remember. And while the new ownership starts talking about redevelopment, a word that sounds like improvement but often means erasure, the ranch settles into a familiar posture, guarded, quiet, controlled. The fences still draw their lines. The road still disappears inward. The grass airstrip still reads as a kind of private artery, whether it's used or not. The desert still looks the same from a distance, which is why distance is so valuable. The public side of the story, meanwhile, doesn't get renamed so easily. The state still has its own dates to remember. The state still remembers that in 2019 it was forced into action over those 1,243 acres of trust land, public ground tied up inside a private envelope. The state still remembers sending a cancellation notice on September 4, 2019, setting a 30-day fuse, trying to reassert authority with paper, because paper is what it has. And the public remembers in a different way, less tidy, more visceral. The public doesn't remember parcel numbers. It remembers the feeling of a gate that won't open. It remembers a place becoming a symbol of how money and isolation can outpace law. So the ranch wears its new name like a fresh coat, Rancho de San Rafael. It sits there under the same sky, pretending to be older than its own scandal, pretending to be just another Western spread with a saint in its title. The machinery of ownership keeps turning. The staff changes. The contractors come and go. The desert keeps working on the edges, but the question stays, was this renaming a genuine attempt to reclaim a place from its notoriety? Or was it just the first move in a longer strategy to outlast memory, until the state, the survivors, and the public decide that memory isn't optional and that knowing has to be paid for in something more than a new sign at the gate? They say the truth comes out on its own, like water finding daylight, like a body surfacing. They say all you have to do is wait long enough and the facts will rise, clean and undeniable, and the guilty will stand there blinking in the sun. But the truth doesn't rise by itself. The truth is hauled up. The truth is funded. The truth is a line item. And if nobody pays for the rope, the bucket stays at the bottom of the well. Santa Fe, not out in the sage this time, but in a building that smells like old carpet and burnt coffee and paper that's been handled too many times. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with that steady, indifferent hum. Wood desks scarred by decades of elbows. Microphones that crackle when someone clears their throat. A room built for procedure, not for grief. In rooms like this, history doesn't arrive on horseback. It arrives in binders. A staffer sets a stack of documents on a table, thick, heavy, the kind of stack that makes a dull sound when it lands. Numbers on the pages, dates, names that aren't names, corporate skins, trusts, shells, because in America, the first layer of truth is usually a veil you have to lift with legal fingers. Somebody flips through and the pages whisper. Somebody else takes a pen and taps it twice, a nervous little metronome. Outside, the mountains sit there as they always have, indifferent to legislation. Inside, people are trying to decide whether the state should turn its attention back toward a place it didn't want to look at too closely when looking wasn't politically convenient. They call it a truth commission, a phrase that sounds solemn and clean until you remember how much filth can hide behind solemn language. A truth commission is, in theory, a lantern, something you carry into a dark room when you can't trust the room to light itself. It is not a courtroom. It is not a verdict. It is a formal, funded act of looking. And looking in the right direction can be the most dangerous thing a government does to itself. Because the ranch is not just a rumor anymore. It is acreage and square footage and public records. It is 7,622 acres of high desert that once carried a name that became a kind of curse. It is a main house of roughly 26,100 square feet, built up by 1999, sitting there like an argument someone made with money, and stitched inside the story like a barb. 143 acres of state trust land, public ground, that the state leased into that private envelope, then tried to claw back when the headlines made complicity uncomfortable. That history sits under the fluorescent lights, whether anyone wants it there or not. Someone mentions July 16th, 2019, the day the state moved more than 400 pages of land records and lease documents over to the Attorney General's office. 400 pages doesn't sound like much until you imagine the weight of it. Imagine carrying it down a hallway, feeling the stack pull at your wrists, realizing every page is a small admission. We had a relationship with this place, and we didn't ask too many questions until the world forced our hand. Someone else mentions September 4th, 2019, when the Land Commissioner's Office sent a cancellation notice trying to reassert authority over public land with the only weapon bureaucracies trust, paper and deadlines. A 30-day fuse, procedure, courtesy even, as if courtesy is what a locked gate respects. These are not just dates. They are scars in the state's timeline. Now, in the wake of all that, after the death on August 10, 2019, after the long attempt to sell and rename, after the reported sale in August 2023 to a newly formed company whose name reads like a fresh coat of paint, the legislators are confronted with a simple problem. The public wants answers, and answers cost money. There is talk of funding, figures floated, debated, sharpened. Around $2.5 million comes up as the kind of money you'd need to do this properly. Investigators, staff, records requests, witness support, security, experts who know how trafficking networks function, and lawyers who can keep the whole thing from collapsing under its own legal weight. $2.5 million is nothing next to the wealth that built that ranch. It is also, in a state budget, enough to make people flinch. You can feel it in the room. Some of them want to do the right thing. Some of them want to look like they did the right thing. Some of them want this to go away without ever admitting how long it was allowed to exist as a shadow on the state's map. And then the survivors' names come into the air, sometimes spoken, sometimes withheld, sometimes reduced to a witness, a victim, a complainant, because the system has a way of turning living people into categories. When you talk about truth commissions, you always end up talking about human beings who were treated like they didn't count. And that's where the room shifts, because even the most practiced politician knows the temperature changes when the story stops being abstract. A survivor's testimony, whether it's read, paraphrased, or simply referenced, doesn't arrive politely. It arrives like weather. It turns the air heavy. It makes the jokes die in throats. It makes a man stare at his hands as if his hands are responsible for what his government did or didn't do. It makes a woman blink hard and stare at the ceiling lights for a second just to steady herself. Because this is what the state is really debating, not whether a ranch existed, not whether the acreage is real, not whether the gate stayed locked. Those are settled facts in the public mind. The debate is whether the state is willing to look at itself in the mirror long enough to see what it enabled. A truth commission, if it's honest, doesn't just ask what happened on 7,722 acres of desert. It asked why the state's own 1,243 acres of trust land sat inside that envelope for years without the kind of scrutiny that would have come down hard on a poorer rancher for half the paperwork violations. It asks why procedure was treated like protection. It asks why power is allowed to become privacy, and privacy becomes a kind of unofficial immunity. And you can feel the resistance, too, the instinctive recoil of institutions when they sense accountability moving toward them. Questions about scope, about authority, about jurisdiction, about whether this is duplicative, about whether this is the best use of funds. Clean phrases that are really just old fear wearing a tie. Because the state knows something that doesn't get said out loud. You can't investigate a desert empire of secrets without digging up the systems that let it stand in the first place. The trusts, the leases, the gatekeepers, the quiet arrangements between public land and private control, the social fabric that makes powerful visitors feel welcome and makes the workers feel replaceable. When the hearing ends, chairs scrape back, papers get gathered. The room empties with that particular hush that follows heavy testimony, like everyone is trying to walk quietly enough to avoid stepping on what they just heard. Outside, the sky is still blue and bright, and Santa Fe keeps selling its image of beauty and art and history. Out beyond it, the ranch sits under the same sun it always has, wearing whatever name the deed currently calls it. And the question that hangs there isn't whether the truth exists. The question is whether the country will pay to see it, and if it does, what it will do with what it finds when the mirror finally turns from one man and one ranch toward the larger American machinery that made a place like that possible in the first place. They'll tell you America is too loud for secrets, that the country is all headlights and subpoenas and bored journalists with time on their hands. They'll tell you you can't build a private kingdom anymore, not in a nation with satellites and smartphones and a hunger for scandal. It's a comforting myth. It lets people sleep. It tells them the world is self-correcting, but the truth is older than electricity. The truth is that this land was made for silence, wide enough to swallow confession, dry enough to preserve it, and stitched through with laws and leases that can make public ground feel private if the fences are drawn right. And when the money comes, when the paper changes hands, when the right people decide that what happens behind a gate is nobody's business, the modern world becomes less omniscient than it likes to pretend. So we return to where we began. Late summer again. The same kind of afternoon where the light feels less like warmth and more like judgment. Heat rising off the road in thin, wavering curtains. The desert air sharp with dust and juniper and sun-baked rock. A smell like old bones and clean wind. A state vehicle pulled off the shoulder. A man standing there with his shirt stuck to his back, sweat at his temples turning gritty the moment it meets the air. Papers in his hand, the papers warm from the sun, corners curling. A simple job in a complicated world. He walks to the gate, and the gate is still a gate. Steel, practical, unromantic, the kind of thing that could be anywhere cattle might wander, But the lock, always the lock, has the confidence of money in it. The lock is not there to keep animals in, it's there to keep questions out. The chain holds fast. The road beyond disappears into scrub and distance, into acreage and ownership and whatever name the property wears today, because names change. They change the way a suit changes. Zorro Ranch, Rancho de San Rafael, corporate skins, clean letterhead, new signage, old ground. The deed can be moved from one entity to another like a poker chip slid across felt. $12 million in 1993 becomes $27.5 million in 2021, becomes $18 million when the market tells the truth in the only language it trusts. A sale in August 2023 to a company nobody knows for a price nobody says out loud. Paperwork shuffling history into filing cabinets, hoping time will do what time always does, make the public tired. But the land is not tired. The land remembers in the only way it can. It remembers by refusing to change its face. The same mesas, the same rock seams, the same dry channels that look harmless until rain turns them into knives. The same wind worrying at fences, patient as hunger. The same stars coming out at night hard and bright, indifferent to who arrived by road and who arrived by air. The same quiet that can feel like peace until you realize peace isn't just the absence of noise. Sometimes it's the presence of control. And this is what that ranch has always been. Beneath every story people tell themselves about it, control expressed as geography, control expressed as distance, control expressed as the ability to decide who is allowed to see and who must stay outside holding paper in the sun. America loves to frame these stories as monsters, one man, one place, one aberration that proves the system works, because we can point at it and say, there, that's the exception. But the deeper truth is that the system is what made the exception possible. It wasn't built by one pair of hands. It was built by a workforce that poured concrete and ran conduit and checked gates and changed filters and kept the whole thing humming. It was built by lawyers who understood how to fold property into trusts and companies, so responsibility would always be one step behind the truth. It was built by institutions that leased public land, 1,143 acres of it, into a private envelope and called it normal until it became embarrassing. It was built by a culture that treats the West like a stage for reinvention, where money can buy not just land, but a second identity. And still, even with all that machinery, leases and cancellations, hearings and proposals, budgets measured in millions, documents stacked in piles heavy enough to hurt your wrists, the gate does not confess. The gate does not apologize. The gate does what it has always done. It stands there and divides the world into inside and outside. There's something mournful in that, and something impressive, not admirable, not righteous. Impressive the way a storm is impressive, because it reminds you how small you are and how little your feelings matter to the forces that shape your life. A place like this doesn't need to argue. It doesn't need to persuade. It just needs to exist long enough for people to look away. And maybe that's the most American part of the whole story. Not the mansion, not the acreage, not the scandal, but the faith. Quiet, stubborn, well-funded. That time will smooth everything down. Turn the sharp edges into folklore. Turn the ugly facts into rumor. Turn a locked gate into just another detail on a long road nobody feels like driving. So the camera pulls back, slowly, almost reluctantly, past the chain and the lock, past the cattle guard, past the state vehicle parked on the shoulder, The man becomes smaller. Then the gate becomes smaller. Then the whole ranch becomes what it always wanted to be, a private shape on a public landscape. The road turns into a line. The line disappears into the desert. The desert spreads out in all directions, vast enough to hide almost anything. And you're left with the oldest question the West ever asked, the one every empire tries to outrun and never can. When a country can rename the land, sell the land, fence the land, and still call itself free, what exactly do you think truth is worth? And whose legacy did you just agree to carry?